everyone. Welcome to the Tell Me More About podcast, where we talk about this past weekend's sermon. We dig a little bit deeper into the content, and you might have noticed that we've been gone for a couple weeks, and we are back. We're going to have 2 episodes in June, and then we'll have 2 more in July, and we are jumping into Proverbs for our summer series. So, hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
I'm good.
How are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Well, we don't have power at the house right now, so
we also
don't need it, do you?
We don't have power either.
If you're listening from, I guess, afar or outside of Tulsa, we had a storm come through Sunday night, and much of the city is still without power. So lots of people are hot, but we're otherwise really good.
Yeah. Everybody's doing okay, except there's lots of trees that were formerly standing upright are now
that are not now.
They're in the road and inconvenient.
Yeah, it's sad, but other than that, it's been good. Had a good Father's Day. I'm in a good spot. Feel good.
Proverbs feels really appropriate for Father's Day to kind of dive into. It's wisdom literature, and we did kind of think about that a little bit as we were preparing coming into this weekend. So it was kind of a guiding thought. You think?
As we were coming to the weekend, I was thinking more about the series. Yeah, we did. Absolutely. Yeah, that kind of fatherly wisdom. Sure. Yeah, it was something to take into account.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we did talk about it, like the father writing to his son, Solomon, son of David, all of that stuff.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so you're talking about like the father-son or parent-child just sort of relationship of Proverbs as a sort of posture for how I enter the book.
Yeah. Was there anything else this summer, like a reason around why we chose Proverbs?
No. I'm sure there was. I don't remember it now.
Well, we've done Psalms in the past, and so Proverbs felt like...
Well, the summer is kind of, you get a lot of different people speaking because, I don't speak as much in the summer, which by design, and so... you wanted some theme to kind of hold everyone together, but enough flexibility to be able to cover different topics and play to different, communicator strengths and so forth. And Proverbs was great. We've not been through the book of Proverbs, and this isn't really like a study of the whole book of Proverbs. It's just sermons from the book of Proverbs.
Yeah. And Proverbs is kind of interesting because it's like these short, pithy statements. And so it's hard to just look at a section of text and say, I'm just going to walk through this text right now.
Yeah. So it's not, there are sections where there are themes, but then there are starting in chapter 10, all of these like fortune cookie statements that are more than that, but they feel a little bit that way for a long time, all the way to chapter 31, I guess. And so trying to draw like I'm going to preach. They're not all like related to one another. So trying to preach a theme out of it or whatever, a sermon out of it, it's a little harder to do than some other books or parts of the Bible that are maybe a little bit more thematic.
Yeah. So what was prep like this week?
Hard.
Yeah. Why was it hard?
Because the essence of a sermon to me is trying to understand. The hard work is figuring out what you're saying. And sometimes that's more easily discovered than other times. So I had some thoughts coming into, based on my reading of Proverbs, coming into this week. I've been off for a couple of weeks, and I come in with a couple of thoughts I wanted to talk about, particularly, and they ended up being what I shared, which is sort of this idea of submission and then agency, but trying to figure out what those concepts were. I could see sort of the truth of the idea, what you referenced a minute ago, that Proverbs is a book written from fathers to sons, or parents to children. The idea being that you have to approach that book with a submissive posture, that you're not... That you're here to receive instruction, which is a posture of humility, and that's not always easy, and it's a posture of listening. But I don't know, for me, figuring out how to say all of that and what's the word, is it submission, is it humility? They're related to each other. Which is which? How do you want to talk about it? And then particularly the concept of agency, which I think shows up through the book of Proverbs and is really a biblical theme that sort of a take responsibility for yourself kind of theme. And the Bible maybe directly says and places and then also implies, just even in the way that it's written. Certainly Proverbs is a book, how would I put it, written with a sort of framework of agency. I mean, the whole implication is that you're going to do something with what you're reading. These are not just, wisdom to memorize, to have a witty response in an argument, but to actually know what to do in life. And so yeah, there's an assumption of agency, like read and do. Of course, we get that in the New Testament. Don't just be a hearer, be a doer of the word. So that's something of the idea of agency, but figuring out a way of saying all of that. I don't know. Sometimes for me, concepts are hard to, it's just hard for me to frame, hard for me to figure out how to make practical, how to make it where people can relate to it. I think I spend a lot of time thinking about where does the rubber hit the road? Where do I not want to do this? Why would I not want to submit? What does a lack of submission look like? What does submitting look like? And all of those things. And so you just have to, so sometimes, when I'm writing a sermon, it's like the ideas sort of present themselves really quickly and you go, okay, that's exactly what I'm saying. And it doesn't mean you don't work on it anymore, but it just means that like you have clarity around the heart of what you're trying to say. And then other times you find yourself sort of wandering in a room in the dark, sort of going, what is it that I'm looking for? And you'll question all sorts of things. I've learned down through the years that, just giving myself space, that there'll be an answer. I don't have to panic, that it'll come to me. And so, but it does require a lot of thought. So much of my sermon writing happens in my head and not, like sitting down. I mean, there is a sort of active part where I'm literally sitting there with an iPad trying to write out a sort of, I don't want to call it a script, but manuscript that I don't follow, but that does give me some language for the things I'm going to say. And that's one way of doing it, but another way of doing it is like driving around and thinking, or standing in the shower and talking to myself in my head. Is a way of it's like an organization of thought. Yeah. So it's like walking into a big cluttered room. As you can imagine, you have lots of ideas in your head, right? Lots of things could be said. Yeah, and so you're like walking and going, how am I going to organize this?
Yeah, it's not that you couldn't talk about it for a really long time, whatever the topic might be.
That's right.
But it's honing it in and focusing
making it
on
cohesive and effective over what you don't want to get into in a sermon is go, okay, I forgot to say this earlier. All right, remember this. So, it's like you want there to be some cohesion to the whole thing and for it to be approachable and easy to understand and all of that. And that's the hard work.
Really, in that way, you want to serve people because you want them to be able to receive
Absolutely.
as easily as they possibly can what you're trying to get across and what you're trying to say.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's the kind of sermon writing process.
Palatable. It's one thing to have a discussion. And honestly, like these require no preparation for me because it's easy to have a conversation around a topic. But when you're trying to figure out, you're just the only one speaking, that's tougher. Much tougher.
Yeah. And you're talking about something like submission and agency, which are two kind of difficult ideas to not necessarily to unpack, but to help people kind of say, yes, this is something that I realize I need in my life or that I have, and I need to act on it more.
Well, interestingly, I did find the idea of agency hard to unpack. But even describing what it was in a way that could quickly be understood was difficult for me. It took me a couple of tries, even on the weekend, to realize I'm not quite saying it the way that I want to.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, because we all have agency in some form. It's whether or not we use it.
Yeah, or even what do I mean by agency? It's not a word that too many people use on a daily basis. And I don't want to turn a sermon into a psychological, self-help session. But
so if you were to define it in like layman's terms, what would you say agency is?
Oh man, so yeah, I mean the best, I think the definition, I never wrote it down, the one I came up with was something like the willingness to act upon the things that are within your control. Probably something like that. Or maybe the capacity, the choice to act upon what's in your control. And so agency, in some sense, is a choice of taking responsibility for things that you could take responsibility for. No sense in, I can't have agency over something I personally couldn't have any agency over the American economy. I contribute so little to it in the sense of just being one person that I can't affect it. But if I'm, let's say, chairman of the Federal Reserve or whatever that role is, I mean, yeah, then you have a little agency there, like in ways where president of the United States, or maybe if you're working in a senator or congressman or whatever, you may have a bit more agency there that I don't have. So it's acting upon the things you have a measure of control over, which. Yeah.
So this weekend, you kind of opened up the sermon by saying that physical maturity is inevitable, but emotional maturity or spiritual maturity is optional. And I think we've all encountered people who are like, they're full adults physically, but they still have they have childlike tendencies.
I think we encounter those people every time we look in the miror.
That I actually agree with
It's not just them, it's us.
Yeah.
Right? That's me.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I throw a fit when my wife tells me no, or lose my cool for no reason or whatever, or freak out over something honestly small. I mean, those are all ways that I behave like a child. And I get told that from time to time. You're behaving like a child, and it's good because I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, emotional maturity is optional, and it's something that you have to work at. Physical maturity just happens. You don't have to do anything for it. I mean, there's certainly, I'm sure a nutritionist would tell me that there's some things that could aid with that, but in general, it happens. And then, but emotional maturity, not so much. So yeah, we do know people who are 50 outside and 13 on the inside.
How does Proverbs address emotional maturity?
Oh, well, I think in some ways, it's the point of the book.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? You're trying to go from being an unwise or a simple person to a wise person.
Yeah.
And a wise person will be one who's shrewd in, matters of business, relationships, many things, but also there's there's lots of things that refer to the emotions in the book. We were talking about some of those today as wisdom to cover an offense or whatever. It's like, I'm not going to, in other words, don't freak out over everything. A fool gives full vent to his anger, right? Or his emotions. That's an emotional proverb there, right? So there's a goal of learning to put those in their proper place. Emotions have a place.
Yeah, they do. So a lot of times we would give more credence to IQ or that like
intellectual intelligence.
But really Proverbs is a book about EQ, about emotional intelligence.
Well, interestingly, I mean, I think you can probably do something to improve your IQ a little bit, but relatively fixed. I think you can do a lot to improve your emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
That EQ quotient, that can go up dramatically. I'm living proof. I mean, I'm not anywhere near having arrived, but much different person than I was in my 20s. Some of that's age, but heck, we all know people who are just as defensive, just as insecure, all of it as they were when they were a kid. And so change is not inevitable; it's optional. But yeah, you're learning to regulate those things and learning to put them in their proper place and understand who you are and sort of the relationship to the people around you. Where do you fit? How do you fit? What's your role? What's their role? How do you relate to each other? All of those things are part of, I think, your emotional intelligence.
Yeah. So if you are recognizing an area of emotional immaturity in yourself, or if somebody else has kind of called it out of you, is it how do you grow in that area? It's not simply like an act of the will, is it? Like, would you just say, I'm not going to be angry anymore, and then it happens?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I guess I think a lot about acting in accordance with truth. I think there's some measure of truth in that, but there's probably more to it than that. The actual mechanics, and this is something that maybe I should study a little bit more, but the actual mechanics of how people change is not something that I'm terribly well versed in. What I feel like my role is to sort of point out, hey, here's what's
Yeah.
true. And then people have to figure out, I mean, maybe I should do more of that. I don't know. You have a thought about that?
Yeah. So
How do you do it?
How do you do it? Well, your maturity, actually, you talked about it this weekend.
Okay, good.
So
Maybe
maturity
I know more than I know.
you do actually. Okay. Maturity is access through your identity. So a person is only willing to change in as much as their identity can be accessed.
Right.
But you access that through what psychologists or therapists would call attachment. And so it's your attachment to your parent. So the father to son, or even God speaking to you about who you are, when you're actually able to receive that at the identity level, then you're able to grow. So, yeah.
So it begins with identity.
It does,
which
yes.
is what we talked about. So what I was gonna say, my first thought is actually submission, because there is a sort of submission is a willingness to not just say, okay, I'll obey, but it's a willful choice to believe that you know better for me and about me. And so when I'm submitting to the Lord, I am, in essence, how would I put this? I'm wanting what he wants for me, even when what he wants for me contradicts what I feel like I want for myself. So it's a choice to say, I don't want to do that, but I know what you want for me is better than what I want for myself, and therefore I'm going to do what you say. So it's more than a blind obedience.
Yeah.
It's a full trust that you know what you're talking about, God. And there's and that's both, and I talked about this, the word son, my son, which shows up like 50 plus times in Proverbs, is both relational, and I don't think I said this on Saturday night, but it's both relational and positional. So there's one part about it that is attachment, right? I am my father's son, or I am my father's daughter. I belong to them. I am theirs. They're mine. There's this, I do this with my kids. It's interesting even why I feel compelled to say it. I think I know, but I want to remind them of the nature of our relationship. You're my son. You're my daughter. I love you. You're my daughter. You're mine. So there's that relational component, but then there's a positional component. My son Elliot lately has been calling me bro a little bit. And last night he did it. He's like, bro. And I'm like, I'm not your bro. Stop calling me bro. It's disrespectful. You can call me dad. You can call me lots of things. Stop calling me bro. I'm not your bro. And it's not me being uptight. It's me reminding him of the nature of our relationship. There's a positional quality to it. I love you dearly. I would do anything for you, but you're still my son. So it's both, do you see that? Like it's both relational and positional. And that's part of, I think, what submission, that's a big part of what submission is both. And you see that in Christ, by the way. Relational, this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. You get that twice, but on the Mount of Transfiguration and at the baptism. But then you also get, not my will, but your will be done, Jesus saying in the garden, bending the knee, submitting to his Father's will. I only do what my Father tells me to do. So you get both relationship, total connection, complete love, and acceptance of the Son, but also surrender of the will. This is a positional relationship. I'm not doing what I want to do. I'm trusting you.
And these two are related to each other in so much as you can only trust that positional relationship as much as
That's
you
right.
are.
That's exactly what I said.
Okay.
So you're preaching my sermon, but that's exactly what I said. I said they have to come in that order. Right? Well, it's the same thing. So basically what God says about you and what he says to you. So what he says about you is your identity. Who am I? Who am I? And of course, we're living in a time where we're trying, like there's lots of conversation we could have, and we probably could do a multiple podcast conversations on sort of the nature of identity formation and how it has happened and how it is happening and why it's flawed and what Christian identity looks like. But suffice it to say, it's understanding who I am in relationship to God and how much he loves me at the heart level, not just the head level. And believing that, choosing to believe that beyond what I think about myself. You talked about this in your little, I guess, homily on leading us into communion when you're talking about receiving the way that Jesus wants to, like receiving him on his terms rather than on my own terms, how I feel about myself. So many of us want to elevate our own self-perceptions above, I'm no good, I'm whatever, I'm unlovable, I'm unforgivable, all of this above what God says about us. And there's a subtle pride in all of that, which you were sort of pointing out this weekend. Peter it's interesting in his, it's funny how self-effacing sort of this false humility is actually pride. It's pride masquerading as false humility. Don't wash my feet. How dare you? You don't need to do that. And really, it's not a humility at all. It's actually a pride. If you don't do this, you have no part of me, is what Jesus said. So it's receiving what God thinks and says about me greater than what I say about myself. And then also the position, which is, he has every right to command me to do whatever, and I'm going to follow, and I'm going to obey, and I'm going to listen to that. And so that's the position, like, don't call me bro. He's God. He's Father. What he says, if he says stay, I'm going to stay. If he says go, I'm going to go wherever he leads. So my point in all of that is that you become enamored with a different thing. I think when you're asking how do you change, I do think that when I understand those two things, this is what I found myself meditating on, is that when I know who I am, I can endure just about anything. Like if I know God's for me, it's amazing what you can endure. It's like, well, I don't love this job, but God put me here. I'm just going to keep doing it.
Yeah.
So you're not sitting there banging your head against the wall because you know there's purpose in what you're doing. It's amazing. Like we need that. And so like I said, I'm thinking change. And the idea of change, I know that the idea of change is deeply connected to the heart and identity and more than just the actions. White knuckling doesn't work. But it is becoming, I think what changed my life is that I became more enamored with wanting to do what God wanted me to do and seeing myself in relationship to who he is. And that started to change me more than I've just got to be a better person. I spent very little time thinking about that. I started realizing, oh, wow, he's been really gracious to me in ways that I did not earlier recognize. I've been really awful. Oh, wow, I should probably repent. Oh, wow, I should probably not treat people that way anymore. All of those things are it's a downstream consequence of an upstream change of heart and understanding, is that I'm loved by God, but also that I was a sinner really much more significantly than I knew. Yeah,
so much of that revolves around the understanding of who God is too. So you have A.W. Tozer who says the most important thing about you is what comes to your mind when you think about God.
Right.
But then there's also this kind of idea from C.S. Lewis where he says, actually, the most important thing about you is what God thinks about you.
Fascinating.
And so and just this idea that God is going first in all things. So it doesn't really matter what you think about God unless he's thinking about you first. And so, it's kind of interesting how you talk about your willingness to change as you understand that God is gracious, compassionate, merciful, slow to anger.
So then I want to reflect that as the more I understand his character. So it is being sort of fascinating. It's around the allurement of the heart, less the sort of mind, the will to change in another way. So I've got to be drawn to something as beautiful to want to sort of become that. And so as I saw God in a fuller and more beautiful way, I wanted to be like him as a result, and that then thereby started shifting and changing me because the heart started to shift instead of just the mind and will.
Yeah. So what's interesting is you're talking about submission, but you're also talking about understanding that you have a desire to do things differently. And so there's kind of this submission side of it, and then there's this agency side of it. So as you've grown in your understanding of what submission is, you also understand, or anyone would understand, that it's incumbent upon them to do something with what they are now understanding. So
it's not all passive. So the submission part is a passive reception. It is receiving. And again, reading, and I don't have my Bible in front of me, but reading the first just few verses of Proverbs, to receive. I think it's words of instruction or words of insight, something like this. A proverb or a saying, and it's riddles or something like this. There's so much language of hearing, receiving, taking things in. So there's this passive, you're a son, receive this, listen, hear. That's the passive part of it. And then there's the active part of it, which is agency, which does show up in the first chapter. My son, if sinners entice you to go, lie in wait, let us lie in wait for innocent blood, don't go with them. It's this.
You do have a choice.
You have a choice. Which voice will you listen to? And when it comes time to make a choice, you're going to have to stand up and make a choice that won't always be easy. It might come in the face of criticism, but there's a certain amount of, and that's part of agency. It's not all reflected in chapter 1, but at least it has, I think, some roots in chapter 1. But the idea is honestly, quite simply, taking responsibility for yourself, which is not as easy to do as it might seem. One of the things I said on Sunday that I didn't say on Saturday, and I wish I would have, it didn't occur to me till Sunday, is that immature people spend a lot of time worrying about things they can't control. So, friend and mentor of mine, Doug Slaybaugh, talks about it like this. There's some issues in life you have no control over. Some you have partial control over, and that would be every relationship, every relational issue you ever had is all partial control, right? You can't control how someone else is going to respond. Partial. Then there's full control. Things I have total control over. None, partial, and full. So there's some things in life that you have no control over. We were talking about earlier. The economy, let's say, is something I can't really control. Maybe I could consider my vote as some measure of control, but that's a relatively small lever I can pull, and only every so often, right? So sitting around worrying around things I can't control, I think immature people spend a lot of time worrying about stuff they have no measure of control over. But conversely, they do very little with the things they do have control over. So we worry about stuff that's completely out of our control, and we're not doing anything with the things that are within our control. You see that in the parable of the talents. That's particularly the guy who buries his talent in the dirt. I knew that you were a harsh man, and all of this sort of stuff. And so I just decided to do nothing. It's a worrying about something that you really have no control over, but then doing nothing with what you did have control over, which is what gets him in a lot of trouble with the master. So I think that's the case. I think that's where we live, is we are frustrated with things. Here's how that works out relationally. I'm frustrated with what my husband is or is not doing, and I spend all of my time obsessing over that. Now, I have partial control there, so maybe, in my case, it would be my wife. I'm in a relationship with her. Certainly, her actions affect me. Mine affect her. It's not that it's not worth thinking about at all. But goodness, proportionally, the amount of time that I'm spending thinking about her and what she should do versus thinking about what me and what I could do is disproportional. So the scales are weighted in terms of we're giving our effort, thought, attention, obsession to things I can do nothing about, and spending very little time on the things I actually could do something about. And I think a mature and wise person is the person who focuses their energy on the things. That is the essence of agency, is doing something with the things. But there's and Proverbs 131 or 32, something like this, says the complacency of fools destroys them. And the word is referring to laziness, that there's a certain laziness to it. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. That's what M. Scott Peck, I read that sort of excerpt from his book. Basically, he talks about how leading is that if you assemble a group of people together, a dozen, it won't take any time before one or two of them will assume the role of leader. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because some people just like to lead. That would be me. I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. I would just generally take charge of something rather than see myself get swept up into the desires of some other foolish person. I would rather just be in control. It's not always good, but So I could fit in that category. Several of us could. But the second reason why this happens so there's no process. No one sits around and goes, who's most qualified to lead? It's not illogical. It just sort of happens. He said the second reason why is because it's simply easier to follow. There's no need to agonize over complex decisions. There's no need to, you're not going to risk unpopularity, anything. You can just sit back and do. It's interesting. If you've ever watched Survivor, the people who like step out in the front and take the lead, they almost never win the game.
They're vulnerable. Yeah.
It's interesting. And it's the people who kind of lay back behind the scenes and play the longer game that way. They end up, because they kind of stay out of the fray in a lot of ways.
Oh, man.
You see that. Anyways,
Sorry, I'm going on a rabbit trail, but that world, the Survivor world, isn't set up for human flourishing. It's set up for winning because it's a competition.
Yeah.
And so that's not going to serve in that game very well to be a leader.
Interesting.
And to be even a sacrificial leader.
Because you're going to risk unpopularity and it's going to get you out of the game.
Yeah.
Because everyone else sort of holds all the power.
The goal of the game is to win, not to help people.
That's true.
Yeah. It could come in handy at different points in the game, but
similarly in life, it's like it's easier to follow. It's easier to lay back and there's a certain laziness to it. And what he says is that the role of follower, and this is sort of offensive, but I think it's so many ways, but I think it's helpful to hear, is that the role of follower is the role of child. Because you're, in essence, handing over your agency, your right to, or your responsibility for your life, like a child would. What should I wear? I see this all the time. What should I eat? This shows up all the time in work, right, with us. So one of the things is you're trying to develop people. You run into this sort of learned helplessness when you say, well, here, what are we? We're doing nothing around here for leadership development. Okay, what are you doing for leadership development? Nothing. Okay. So why not? Well, because that's not my job. No one assigned that to me. It's not, and it's like so essentially there's a real lack of agency, right? Where essentially we all want to sort of point at other people and say, well, they, them, they're not. That can be really dangerous in a work culture too, by the way.
And it is interesting how when you begin to take responsibility for yourself, you talked about that this weekend, how there's this, like when there's an increase in agency and submission, there's the maturity that comes with it, but everyone benefits from it. And so there's never a moment where you're going to take responsibility for yourself and it's not going to benefit somebody else, but it's going to take time. It's not going to show up immediately. Like if I'm on a team with 5 people and I'm taking responsibility for myself, the person sitting directly next to me might benefit from it within like a week.
They might also resent it.
They might resent it.
Right? If you start taking responsibility in a job, they might wonder. Your coworkers might think, why are you making the rest of us look bad? Why are you're just a brown noser, you're a teacher's pet, you're trying to play to the boss or whatever. And there may be some downside. I think ultimately though, it will win out in the end. Yeah. Maybe not even in that situation, but I think ultimately it does work out for the good. And I think in general that's what happens.
Yeah. And you're really speaking a lot to relational health in this context. Like if there's not relational health, then you're going to inevitably have that kind of pointing the finger, oh, you're my enemy. If you're not for me, you're against me kind of thing. So
because here's what's happening is that when you start to take a personal responsibility, you will by just what's the right word I'm looking for? Sort of not by definition. It's not even by chance, but it's just inevitably. Let's say you will start to expose the laziness of other people. Your responsibility will show out other people, call out the laziness of others, and they don't like that. Yeah. And so there's going to be, and that's not why you do it, by the way. Yeah. And it can't be why you do it, because then that's a really unhealthy sort of form of agency. Yeah. So I'm doing this for because it's right. You've got something. No,
that's why that agency has to flow from that understanding of submission
and identity.
And identity. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not self-motivated. That's why I think I only did it in the Saturday night service, but I close with Philippians 2 because I think it's the most beautiful representation of submission and agency, which is Christ acting, all of this glory and honor and acclaim heaped on him, but only coming through submission to a cross, a death. It talks all about this. And so there's all of this authority and power at the name of Jesus. Every knee will bow. You've got all of this power sort of I don't know if it's coalescing. It's moving toward him. It's like gravity. Like he's becoming the heaviest point, and all the authority.
That's really
and all
interesting.
the power is flowing toward him. But it came as an act of submission.
Yeah, it's almost like it can't help but do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So and they do that. Well, and you read that, my son. Hear your father's words. I think it is in verse 8. Forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland around your neck and around on your head, and something around this on your neck and head. And I don't have those verses memorized, but the idea is like there's this. These are symbols of authority. These are symbols of power. These are symbols of elevation and of status and so forth. And that's what happens.
And I think you said it this weekend that power in the hands of a godly person is a very good thing.
Yeah, it is. It is a really good thing. I think we're power averse these days because of the abuse of power that we've seen within the church. But in lots of other spaces. And so it's interesting. I really do think it's a tactic of the enemy to not only, to interestingly, and there's so much duplicity in this, to expose power gone bad that would have been his own desire to corrupt, but to expose it for the purposes of then saying, see, you can't trust anyone who's in authority at all. Let's just tear down all the structures. Let's not elevate one over another. And so you're seeing the destruction of roles of authority across all the strata of society. And it's unfortunate. A disrespect, all of this shows up, and you see that on both sides of the political spectrum. But yeah, and it's unfortunate, this distrust, mistrust of power. Again, that shows up in both sides. It's not just one, with the sort of a belief that everyone's corrupt in some way or another. And so it causes us to want to either, defund the police or drain the swamp, right? Like those are both, politically charged statements. And I'm not trying to make a political statement here other than just to say that our mistrust of power and power structures or authority structures, I think really hurts us because you're ultimately never going to be able to receive from God if you can't submit to authority, and you'll be ostracized. And of course, we're seeing this from the church, which is and that's not because the church is casting you out, although maybe that has happened, and I don't know for right or for wrong, but rather you'll mistrust the whole institution, organization, whatever of the church, because you don't trust power. You don't trust authority. I've been burned. I got hurt. And so I'm hesitant to submit myself in there again. And I get that, but it's unfortunate because I think it keeps us from, I would say, realizing the sort of full potential of what we can be and what God desires for us to be.
So you grew.
I grew. My grandmother would swear that's true. I'm still growing.
Really?
Yeah. Every time. She's passed on now, but every time I saw her.
Oh.
Have you grown?
No.
I'm 45 years old, Granny. I don't think I'm any taller than I was 20 years ago.
You may have shrunk.
I may have shrunk.
No, you and your grandma.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true.
She probably.
That's true. Yeah.
She probably
she probably shrunk.
Yeah. So, but you did draw. You drew a chart at the end of the service, or your sermon, with 4 different quadrants, and you had submission at the bottom and agency on what is that? X, Y?
Basically trying to say if you have sort of submission going from a negative to a positive, and then agency. I'm trying to do this around this mic stand, going from a negative to a positive, to create 4 quadrants. So create basically 4 options. What happens if I have high submission and no agency? What happens if I have no agency, no submission? What happens if I have all agency and no submission? And basically create extremes that show you sort of where you kind of land. If you were to sort of plot it on a chart, an XY axis, where would you, I felt really intelligent saying that, where you would land sort of, I don't know, emotionally, whatever.
Yeah.
So to kind of break it down, if you have all agency, in other words, you're willing to act and you're going for it, but you have no submission, you're a bully, right? So you have all of this willingness to do something, but you're not submitted to, in this case, the Lord. And we run into a lot of people. This is often people with power.
I would say that this is a lot of times if somebody has experienced some kind of church hurt potentially, that we, in the past, we've quickly elevated people who seem to have
they lack
a lot of agency, and they're like, I'm willing to go do the thing.
Particularly in American culture, because we value efficiency and big and getting things done and doing something significant. And so people that often have these high agency, so there's a lot of boldness, courage, they're type A. They've got a gift of God, I think, which is leadership, and they know how to lead. But when we elevate people like that too quickly, they do end up with a lack of submission, which then they end up hurting people. And so you do find this where there's like a wake of people behind them. It's like, dead bodies sort of littered behind them. And we've heard the podcasts, we know the stories, of this kind of thing within and without the church, of what they did and what they said, blah, blah, blah. And it's not good. It's not good. But it's agency and a lack of submission. When you get that in a leader, it can be a dangerous, hurtful. You can get a lot done, but you also hurt a lot of people. So it's a trade-off. Catty corner to that, which would be all submission and no agency, is just what I labeled a doormat. So this is a willingness to be submissive. And you can honestly see opposite ends of the sort of personality spectrum, the take charge, I'll lead, and then the person who maybe is less inclined to do that and is just naturally a more submissive, agreeable type of personality. It doesn't enjoy rocking the boat as much, but maybe is less, it's less difficult for them to submit to the Lord. There actually is probably a lack of submission in this, and that there's some things God would ask them to do that they're not doing. But let's just say they're more submissive. So they end up as a doormat. Often they end up being taken advantage of by the bully because they're not willing to stand up. So these are folks who really need to work on drawing boundaries, who are probably a little bit more conflict averse. And that shows up in different ways. I have no problem with being with conflict in interpersonal relationships with people I'm close to. I struggle a lot with conflict with people I don't know at all. So like I would rather at a restaurant, if the service was terrible, I'm still leaving a good tip. I would just rather not deal with, I don't want this to be weird. I'll just leave.
Yeah.
I'll not come back, but I'll just leave. Conflict averse, all that. It can show up in different ways, but we need to draw some boundaries, stand up, for ourselves and for what's right and so forth. So that's the other one. And then if you have neither agency nor submission, I labeled this person the troll. You could also call them the critic, and we have no shortage of this type personality. I think the troll is like the really extreme version of that online, which is sort of a malevolent character who's just sort of just tossing dirty bombs into every sort of conversation or issue. And they're not, those are people we don't love. But even I think in a sort of broader sense, there is a certain, and I see this is like with the elevation of social media platforms, right? There's a lot of opportunity to critique without agency. So this is something that I would say to young people to be really careful of, I think is not helpful, is that platforming yourself or using your platform to critique apart from agency. It's relatively easy to critique when you're not doing anything about it.
It's not costly
to you. It just doesn't cost you. Yeah, exactly. You may have been hurt. There may be a long history there, and you may say, "What do you mean? It's cost me a great deal?" Well, like you've been under the thumb of maybe a bully or whatever. But what you're doing right now is not terribly costly. It does take someone to critique an organization, let's call it the church, from within it, and there is that's a harder thing to do. So it's one thing to kind of stand outside and go, see, you're broken. That's why I don't go anymore. Here, 10 reasons why Gen Z doesn't go to church anymore. I'm not interested. I'm a pastor. I could care less. I'm not interested in hearing those from outside the church because it doesn't really, there's no agency. It's just critic. And it's not about, I don't want to hear. It just, to me, it's useless. I would rather be grappling with what we can do better with people who I'm in relationship with.
Moving towards you.
Exactly.
That you have a relationship with.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like divorcing someone and then posting 10 reasons why the marriage didn't work and why it was all their fault. It's like, what good does this do? We're no longer in relationship together. What point? Anyways, and I'm not saying that the church should be above critique. I'm saying that when there's no agency, like what business do I have critiquing things that I'm not actively a part of, that I'm not within? To me, that's just super easy to do. And I think our culture is filled with stuff like that, just throwing opinions out about all manner of things. It's like we do so much better. We'll talk about this weekend, but it's like the babbling of fools. The Proverbs talks a lot about fools babbling. We've got a lot of opportunities to babble, particularly on social media. The world doesn't necessarily need your opinion. I know that you can share it. Keep it to yourself. It would be better if you just kept it to yourself. I can't tell you how many times I've started up a post and I'm just like, you know what? No. No. Yeah. This is not my issue.
Yeah.
The world doesn't need my voice on this. It's not helpful.
And it's not ultimately contributing.
Right.
It's not healing.
Exactly.
It's not building
I'm just
anything.
Throwing out a thought.
Yeah.
No need.
Yeah.
So that's the troll, the critic, whatever. Lack of agency with that submission. And then the far right corner, which is ideally where you want to be, high submission, high agency, I think is what makes one wise or mature. Someone who is acting, which you want. It's like man in the arena. You want action, power, and authority used to the best end, but you want that paired with submission, realizing that, like the centurion the Roman centurion in Matthew 8 said, I'm a man under authority. And Jesus was sort of blown away by his understanding of power and faith and authority and all of this, is this idea that he recognized that his strength, though he can tell this man to go here and that man to go there, and they'll obey, he recognizes that that's not because I'm something. It's because of who I'm connected to, the relation. I'm part of a broader, bigger story here. And crazy to think that Jesus, even within the Trinity, you have Almighty God still choosing within himself to willfully submit to the Son, to the Father. And it's remarkable.
Yeah.
And so, but that's why in Philippians 2, Paul writes, have the same mind in you that is yours in Christ Jesus. It's this willful submission, this choice. So when we submit our power both to God, our position both to the Lord and to, for the good of our communities and our families or our teams, I think people flourish, thrive, and that's the best place to be. It's what makes you mature.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
Thanks.
No, I think seeing those quadrants is really, really helpful for people because they can kind of place themselves and see where they're at along the spectrum of submission or agency.
And probably not all the way to the edge, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm not a full-on troll or I'm not a full-on bully or I'm not a full-on doormat, but I have elements of that in my personality.
I see what I lean into at different times. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's what happens.
Yeah. So this weekend was hopefully incredibly helpful, and hopefully if people are listening to this podcast, it was incredibly helpful.
Incredibly helpful.
So helpful.
Your life has changed.
They're suddenly mature.
Suddenly. We did it. We did a high five.
Okay. Wait.
Come on.